Chapter 4. Back at Ford's Theater, the manhunt for Booth almost ended before it began, when one man, an Army major, rose from his front row seat to pursue the assassin. The man, Joseph Stewart, long-legged at 6'5", decided to leap from the first row across the orchestra pit to the stage. In a few moments, he reached the stage and followed Booth into the wings. Stewart was the lone audience member who chased Booth. Booth continued rushing through the wings of the stage and down the passageway leading to the back door that opened into the alley. A few more seconds and he would be in the saddle. The more immediate danger to Booth lay behind him. Stewart, following him down the passageway, was closing the distance between them with every stride. Booth hoped that Ned Spangler or John Peanut stood on the other side of that door, still holding the rented horse. He burst through the alley door, sucked his lungs full of fresh air, and slammed it shut behind him. Booth spotted his horse standing quietly in the alley, just a few steps away. He eyed the man reclining on the bench near Ford's back wall and commanded, "Give me my horse, boy!" Booth pulled himself up into the black-legged bay mare with a white star on her forehead and grabbed the reins. He bounced himself in the saddle. At that moment, Stewart swung open the theater door and saw Booth about to gallop away. Stewart reached for the reins, but Booth, an experienced rider, spurred and pulled the horse in a tight circle away from Stewart. Stewart tried for the reins again, but Booth broke free and kicked the horse hard. The horse galloped down the alley, vanishing from sight. Booth rode to F Street at the end of the alley. No one blocked his way. He entered F Street and turned right. He had escaped Ford's Theater, barely. Could he escape Washington, its streets filled with thousands of soldiers and loyal citizens, all there to celebrate the end of the Civil War? Booth rode past the Herndon house, where just 2 hours ago he had met with his gang and dreamed of this moment. As he continued east on F, he approached two of Washington's greatest landmarks. To the left, the huge marble patent office. Just weeks ago, it had been the scene of Lincoln's inaugural ball. To the right was the massive marble post office, where hours ago Henry Clay Ford had picked up the letter that he handed to Booth out on the front steps of the theater. Gaslight bounced off the slick, polished walls of both buildings. Booth galloped past the buildings onto Pennsylvania Avenue. Few people saw him as he rode through downtown Washington. This was understandable, however, because Booth rode away from the crowds celebrating on Pennsylvania Avenue. Booth crossed the Capitol grounds, racing under the shadow of the Great Dome. He galloped toward the Navy Yard bridge that led out of the city and into Maryland. Could he reach the bridge and cross it before pursuers or news of the assassination caught up with him? Luck was with him that night. His hard riding kept him ahead of the news. As he approached the river, he slowed his horse to a trot. He saw guards ahead. Be natural, he thought. Don't arouse suspicion. Sergeant Silas T. Cobb was standing watch on the Washington side of the Navy Yard bridge. He saw an approaching rider. He knew his orders. Allow no one to cross the bridge after dark. Cobb and the handful of men under his command prepared to challenge the rider. With a skill only an actor could manage under such stress, Booth prepared for a performance to talk his way across the bridge. The time was between 10:35 and 10:45 p.m. "Who goes there?" Cobb challenged. "A friend," the actor replied. Perhaps Cobb would recognize the star and wave him across with a smile. No such luck. "Where are you from?" "From the city," Booth replied. Cobb asked his destination. "I am going down home, down in Charles County." The sergeant noticed that the horse was wet with sweat and had been ridden hard. Cobb continued to question Booth, asking if he knew that the bridge leaving Washington was closed at 9 p.m. Booth claimed he did not know. He claimed that he had started out of the city late so that the rising moon would light his way. Cobb reluctantly agreed to let Booth pass. This was a lucky break for the assassin. If Cobb refused to let the actor cross the bridge, Booth had no other way out of the city. He could not turn back. He had to cross the river now, at this spot, into Maryland. Open, isolated countryside waited for him on the other side of the bridge. There, he would be welcomed by friends. Armed with only a knife, he could not have fought the soldiers who blocked his way. Had Booth tried, the sergeant and his guards would have shot the actor out of his saddle and the manhunt would have ended then and there, less than an hour after Booth had assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Once over the bridge, Booth turned to see if his henchmen, David Harold, Lewis Powell, or George Atzerodt, followed in the distance. This was their escape route, too. Booth saw no one, neither friends nor pursuers, behind him. From across the river, he saw a beautiful scene, a looming moon high over Washington, with the great dome glowing in the moonlight. He had done it, and he had escaped. Booth and Powell had left behind so much blood. Blood-soaked Sergeant Robinson and Fanny Seward worked to save Secretary Seward's life. Robinson showed Fanny the best way to slow the flow of blood from the wounds with cloths and water. If they could stop the bleeding until a doctor arrived, he might live. Within minutes, the messengers arrived with doctors who relieved Fanny and Sergeant Robinson. The doctors confirmed that, despite their hideous appearance, the wounds were not fatal. To his doctors, Seward looked ghostly pale, corpse-like, but he would live. One doctor treated the others Powell had so viciously attacked: Sergeant Robinson, Fanny, Augustus, and Frederick Seward. As the night wore on, Fanny feared that Powell might return, or other assassins might be lurking in the house. Disobeying her mother, Fanny prowled from room to room, searching for hidden assassins. Finding none, she returned to her father's bedside and sat with him. Weakly, Seward reassured his brave girl that she had done well this night. The Seward house grew quiet again. Everywhere she looked, Fanny saw signs of the horror that she and her family had just survived. She looked at herself, her hands, her arms, her long, pretty dress, all drenched in blood. She could not stop screaming. The president's box at Ford's Theater was also drenched in blood. Mary Todd Lincoln stared at the president. He was still, his head hung low, his chin resting on his chest. She spoke to him, but he did not answer. Clara Harris saw Henry Rathbone, wild-eyed, staggering and clutching his left arm with his right hand. He could not stop the flow of blood flooding over his hand. Booth's knife had penetrated deep. Clara attended to her fiancé's wound. Down in the audience, more than 1,500 people went wild. Some climbed to the stage, asking the occupants of the president's box what had happened. Hundreds of people turned to friends, spouses, and strangers to ask, "Has the president been shot? Who was that man on stage? Was that a knife? What did he say?" Half-crazed voices cried out, demanding vengeance. "Kill the murderer! Hang him! Shoot him! Cut his heart out! Catch him! Don't let him escape!" None of them realized that the assassin was already out the back door. The mood inside Ford's became ugly, dark, and menacing. Under the dim glow of the gaslights, people fled in panic. The voices grew louder until nearly all 1,500 of them created an angry roar. This was a mob. Sitting just a few yards from the door to the president's box, Dr. Charles Leal jumped up from his seat. He made a direct run for the box, ignoring the aisles and jumping over chairs blocking his route. He struggled to get into the box through the door, which was barred by a piece of wood blocking it. Leal, not in his Union uniform, announced his rank and profession. Major Rathbone, standing between Leal and Lincoln, asked the doctor to treat him first, holding up his injured left arm to show his wounds. Leal looked into Rathbone's eyes and, when he determined that the major was in no immediate danger, rushed to the president's side. Dr. Leal introduced himself to Mary Todd Lincoln as a U.S. Army surgeon. He reassured her that he would do everything possible for her husband. As Mary wept, Leal began his examination of the president. Lincoln looked dead. His eyes were closed. He was unconscious. Leal, remembering Booth's bloody dagger and recalling Major Rathbone's severely bleeding wound, assumed that Lincoln had been stabbed. Leal called for a knife. He had brought in no surgeon's tools for a social night at the theater. If Lincoln had been stabbed, how could he stitch the wounds without needle and thread? Leal was handed a pocket knife. He cut open Lincoln's collar, shirt, and coat to examine him for knife wounds. There were none. Then Leal lifted the president's eyelids, studied the pupils, and understood the seriousness of the wound. It was a brain injury. Leal weaved his hands gently through Lincoln's hair as he worked them thoroughly around the head, discovering that the hair was matted with blood. Leal's fingers probed for the source of the blood and found it behind the left ear, a neat round hole, about the diameter of a man's fingertip, clotted with a plug of coagulated blood. Leal's heart sank. He used his fingers to pull the blood clot from the bullet hole. That would relieve the pressure on Lincoln's brain. He dropped to his knees, straddled the president, opened his mouth, stuck 2 fingers down Lincoln's throat and opened an airway. To draw life-sustaining oxygen into the lungs, Leal pressed Lincoln's chest and ordered 2 men to manipulate Lincoln's arms like levers on a water pump. He massaged the president's heart by pressing hard under the ribs. To everyone in the box, the situation seemed hopeless. Then, the president's heart began to beat, and his lungs sucked in a breath. The heartbeat was weak, the breathing irregular, but Abraham Lincoln was still alive. Nevertheless, unless Dr. Leal could stabilize him immediately, Lincoln would die within a few minutes. Leal leaned forward and breathed air from his own lungs directly into Lincoln's mouth and nostrils. Lincoln's breathing improved. Leal paused, studied his patient's face for a moment, and placed his ear over Lincoln's chest. Amid the shrieks, moans, cries, and Mary Todd Lincoln's deep sobs, he listened. The doctor leaned back and saw the president's lungs filling on their own. Quick action had saved the president from immediate death on the floor of Ford's Theater. Still down on his knees, with all eyes fixed upon him, Dr. Leal announced his diagnosis and prediction. His wound is mortal. It is impossible for him to recover. Like Powell, on the night of April 14th, George Atzerodt was armed with a knife and a pistol, a 6-shot revolver. His room at the Kirkwood House was 1 floor above Vice President Johnson's. Alone and unguarded, Johnson had gone to his room for the night. All Atzerodt had to do was knock on his door, and the moment Johnson opened it, plunge the knife into his chest or shoot him dead. Compared with the challenges that faced Booth and Powell, Atzerodt had the easiest job of all. But that night, Johnson escaped death. Atzerodt could not do it. He drank in the hotel lobby, and the more he drank, the worse the plan sounded. He did not knock on Andrew Johnson's door. He left the bar and walked out. Abandoning his mission, Atzerodt got on his horse and rode away. He wasn't sure what to do next. He was about to go on a rambling and error-filled escape journey. In the saddle, a few blocks from Ford's, David Harold celebrated his escape from the Seward House disaster. He had gotten away just in time. No one in the house knew that Powell had an accomplice waiting in the wings. No one pursued him when he fled the scene, and no one at the Seward House saw or could identify him. He was safe for the moment. He was just another man on a horse this night in Washington. He regretted abandoning his accomplice, but when he heard the screaming girl at the window, Harold decided to save himself. Following Booth's escape route, Harold headed toward Maryland. He approached the bridge at 11th Street. Sergeant Cobb and his guards did not want to let another man pass. Cobb challenged him and asked where he was going. "Home," Harold answered. Cobb and Harold argued about whether he would be allowed to pass in violation of the 9 p.m. curfew. Finally, without explanation, Sergeant Cobb waved Harold across the bridge. Somewhere east of the Capitol building, Lewis Powell was not having as easy a time as Booth and Harold in fleeing the city. He had escaped Seward's servant and the others, and no one was chasing him now. But he did not know the city well. It got worse. He somehow lost or abandoned his surest and quickest means of escaping the city, the one-eyed horse Booth had bought. As midnight approached on the night of April 14th, Lewis Powell was in trouble. He was a lone figure standing in the moonlight, lost, unarmed, and wearing a coat stained with blood. He did not know where he was, what to do, or where to go. For the next 2 nights, he slept in a tree. He began thinking of some of the places in Washington that Booth had taken him before. There was a boarding house, he recalled. He might be safe there, if he could just remember the address. 13 miles southeast of Washington, John Lloyd, the proprietor of Surratt's Tavern, went to bed. Although Mary Surratt had told him that afternoon to expect some nighttime callers, they had never shown up. Several miles farther south, on an isolated farm near Bryantown, Maryland, Dr. Samuel A. Mudd, his wife, and their 4 young children were also in bed. Abraham Lincoln slept too. More than 15 minutes after he was shot, he was still on the floor of the theater box at Ford's Theater. Dr. Leal could not leave Lincoln to die on the floor of a theater, a place of amusement. As Leal considered his next move, a woman rushed through Ford's to get to the president. She knew history was being made in the presidential box and had convinced herself that she must be a part of it. Actress Laura Keene's knowledge of the theater's layout enabled her to bypass the audience and crowd that stood between her and Abraham Lincoln. Still wearing her costume and carrying a pitcher of water, that would serve as her passport to the president's box, she made her way up a hidden staircase that took her to a private office near the box. In less than a minute, she had crossed the theater and emerged on the second floor of the same side as Lincoln's box. She talked her way to the door, through the vestibule, and into the box. No one thought to prevent the great Laura Keene from entering the box. The scene fascinated Laura Keene and stimulated her theatrical instincts. Hypnotized by the image of the fallen president, Keene imagined a scene with herself at the center of it. It was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, impossible for her to resist. Could she, the actress asked Dr. Leal, cradle the dying president's head in her lap? It was a shocking request and of no possible physical comfort or medical benefit to Dr. Lincoln, but Dr. Leal allowed it. Laura Keene knelt beside Lincoln, lifted his head, and rested it in her lap. Bloodstains and tiny bits of gray matter from Lincoln's brain oozed onto the cream-colored silk fabric, spreading and adding color to the frock's bright and festive red, yellow, green, and blue floral pattern. Laura Keene cherished the blood and brain-speckled dress she wore this terrible night. In the days ahead, people begged to see the dress, to handle it, and marvel at the stains on it. The dress vanished long ago, but miraculously a few small pieces, 5 treasured swatches, survived. Long ago, the stains, once red, faded to a rust-colored pale brown. She is remembered, not for her talent as an accomplished actress or her lifetime of performances on stage, but for the scene she staged in the president's box. Other great actresses from the 19th century American theater have faded into oblivion, while Laura Keene is still remembered for a single unscripted act that took place over a few minutes in the box at Ford's on April 14, 1865. The President of the United States could not die in a theater. Dr. Leal would see to it that Lincoln would die with dignity, in a proper bed. "Take him to the White House," someone begged. "Impossible," Leal explained. Even the brief carriage ride between Ford's and the White House, over unpaved, muddy streets, gouged with ruts and tracks from hundreds of carriage wheels, would be too much for Lincoln to endure. The bumpy ride would jostle his head wound and instantly kill him. Leal and the others in the box prepared to move Lincoln's body without knowing where they would take him, just knowing that they must take him from that place. Laura Keene's presence in the box brought attention to an uncomfortable fact. She was an actress, this was a theater, and it was Good Friday, the most solemn day on the Christian calendar. But the President of the United States was not worshiping in a church. Instead, he was dying on the floor of a theater, a place of entertainment. Booth, now safely across the Navy Yard Bridge, rode into the dark. Of his 3 accomplices, he needed David Harold the most, more than Powell or Atzerodt. Booth was a creature of the city, and its fancy hotel lobbies, saloons, oyster bars, and gaslit shadows. He did not have the skills he would need to survive in the coming days, those of outdoorsman, hunter, or riverboatsman. But Harold was all of those things, and that's why Booth chose him, above all others, to be his guide. Once Booth crossed the river into Maryland, he rode through a darkened and quiet countryside. Few travelers were using the empty roads. He trotted over the route he had rehearsed the previous year in preparation for the kidnapping plot. As Booth rode on, he searched the horizon for Soper's Hill, the chosen meeting place with Harold. In daylight, it was simple to find the place, but nightfall had obscured the hills. Alone in the country, he was out of his element. Now, Booth was more aware of the pain in his left leg. Near desperation after his hard ride, he glanced at the horizon. He was just beyond Washington city limits. David and the others might be a few minutes ahead or behind him. Booth saw nothing ahead of him. When he turned to look behind him, he heard a noise in the distance, horses' hooves pounding the earth. Was it the first warning of a cavalry patrol in hot pursuit? As the noise grew louder, it sounded, to his relief, like one horse, not many. Then his pursuer came within sight. One small man on a gray horse. Relief trickled down the assassin's spine as he recognized David Harold. The actor was happy to be on safe ground, and now he had his guide. Maryland, although it did not secede from the Union and join the Confederacy at the start of the Civil War, remained a hotbed of secessionists. Maryland was as Confederate as a state could be without actually seceding. If Maryland had seceded and become the 12th star on the Confederate flag, the Union would have been in grave danger. The Union capital would have been completely surrounded by rebel states, isolated from the rest of the North. Booth and Herold spurred their horses, riding southeast to their first safe house a few miles away. Booth probably peppered Herold with questions. Why is he alone? Where is Lewis Powell? Did Powell kill Seward? Did Atzerodt murder the vice president? Herold would have answered that he had not seen Atzerodt since the conspirators parted earlier that evening to carry out the 3 assassinations. He had no idea whether Vice President Johnson was dead. Herold told Booth the details he knew of what had happened at the Seward residence. The trick of claiming Powell was a messenger from the doctor had worked perfectly. Herold heard no gunshots. About 10 minutes after Powell entered the Seward mansion, a servant ran out the front door and into the street screaming murder. And then a girl threw open an upstairs window and started yelling too. This news seemed to prove to Booth the faithful Powell had carried out his mission. But Booth must have been unhappy with Herold for abandoning Powell, whom he especially liked, and Powell would have come in handy if they had to do any fighting during their escape. Booth guessed that Powell, who had never learned his way around the capital city, was a lost man. Booth certainly told Herold of his success at Ford's Theater. This was the assassin's first chance to describe his deed. The actor in him probably made the most of the dramatic story. Outside Ford's Theater, bewildered pedestrians joined the crowd of theater patrons and hovered near the front doors, awaiting the president. The public did not yet know whether Lincoln was still alive. Leal's team carried Lincoln through the lobby, out of the doors, and across the steps where, just 11 hours earlier, John Wilkes Booth had sat reading his letter, calculating whether he would have time to put an assassination plan into action. The crowd gasped when they saw Lincoln being carried out of the theater. They swarmed and surrounded the president. Leal, the doctors, and soldiers cradling the dying president halted. Where should they take Lincoln? Leal scanned the street for a refuge. Straining his voice to be heard by a sword-bearing officer, he shouted a command. "Take the president across the street and into the nearest house." A soldier crossed ahead, pounding on the door, demanding entry. In view of the horrified mob in the street, Dr. Leal pulled another blood clot from the hole in Lincoln's head to relieve the pressure on the brain and tossed the gooey mass into the street. Fresh blood and brain matter oozed through Leal's fingers. When Leal was halfway across the street, soldiers on the other side yelled that the house was locked and no one answered the door. The scene was incredible, impossible. Stranded in the middle of the muddy street with no place to go, the President of the United States was dying in the presence of a mob of hundreds, perhaps 1,000 witnesses. Until this moment, no one had paid attention to William Peterson's neat brick row house next door to the home that had been locked tight. It was a boarding house. Someone opened the front door of the house. A boarder had heard the shouting of the crowd and had gone outside to see what was happening. He stepped outside onto the top of the staircase and raised a candle. "Bring him in here!" he shouted to the sea of people. "Bring him in here!" Lincoln had found a safe house at last. Chapter 5. Riding in open country about 10 miles south of Washington, John Wilkes Booth and David Herold would soon reach their own safe house. They did not expect any trouble on the road. They did not meet any soldiers as they strode toward Surratt's Tavern. If they did, there was no danger because they were riding ahead of the news of the assassination. At this moment, Booth could safely ride past an entire regiment of Union cavalry. Not a soul in Maryland knew yet that Abraham Lincoln had been shot. Within a few minutes of the assassination, the news began spreading, first by word of mouth from Ford's, then by messenger. It traveled no faster than a man could run on foot or ride on horseback. Between 10:30 and 11 o'clock p.m., more than 1,500 people spilled out from the theater onto the streets. They fanned out in all directions, like an unpaid army of newsboys shouting, "Extra!" Block by block, they spread the news. Men ran or galloped to the White House, the War Department, and the homes of cabinet officers. They rushed home and wakened family members, knocked on neighbors' doors, roused children from their beds, spreading the news. Washingtonians were used to getting important news this way. Tonight, like an inferno burning outward in all directions from a single ignition point, the news that Lincoln had been shot spread from Ford's in an ever-widening circle. A few blocks from Ford's, word of another apparent assassination spread from the Seward mansion and into the streets. Neighbors, soldiers, State Department employees, and even some reporters tried to enter the Seward house. Messengers fanned out in all directions shouting about the Seward assassination, just as the news spread from Ford's of the president's assassination. It was only a matter of time before the two groups, bringing word of separate attacks, met in the streets. The same words were exchanged countless times that night. "No, I tell you it was Lincoln who was assassinated." "Impossible. It was Seward. I just came from his house." "And I just came from Ford's. It was Lincoln. It was Seward." Then the terrible truth emerged. It was both. Though unknown at the time, Seward still lived. Both men were attacked. The false information that Seward had been killed would continue to be spread through word of mouth. At 13th and K Streets, someone rang the bell at the home of Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton. A brilliant man with a long record of public service, the president placed in his capable hands the most demanding tasks of the war: raising, training, equipping, and sending into battle the Army of the Union. Creating that army was the largest organizational achievement in American history up to that time. Stanton weeded out unfit and incompetent officers, battled dishonest government contractors who sold the Army low-quality uniforms, rotting equipment, and defective weapons, and endured an epidemic of officers who would not fight. If any man sat at Lincoln's right hand during the war, it was Edwin Stanton. Stanton had been among those to turn down the president's invitation to join him and Mary at Ford's Theater tonight. Instead, he left his office at the War Department and went home to dinner with his wife. Around 8 o'clock p.m., not long before the curtain rose at Ford's, Stanton left his house to visit his friend William H. Seward at his sickbed. Ever since the carriage accident Seward had suffered, Stanton had been a faithful visitor. He returned home about an hour later. After he bid some visiting Army officers good night, he closed his front door and locked it. It was 10 o'clock p.m. He walked upstairs and began undressing for bed. Not long after, the doorbell rang. His wife, still downstairs, unlocked and opened the door. If she had known about the murderous events of the evening, she most likely would have not opened the door. When she heard the, as it turned out, incorrect news from the messenger, she shouted, "Mr. Seward is murdered!" Her cry reached her husband upstairs, who did not believe what he heard. "Humbug!" he shouted down. "I left him only an hour ago." Stanton, still doubting, came downstairs. He found the messenger and several other agitated men. Alarmed by their manner and their story, he decided to ride over to the Seward house to investigate the rumor of Seward's death personally. The ride to the Seward house took only a few minutes, and the first sign was not good. People filled the street and crowded around the Seward's front door. An hour ago, when Stanton had left the Seward home, the street was deserted. Stanton arrived moments before Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles reached Seward's house. A Navy Department messenger shouted unwelcome and again inaccurate news. President Lincoln has been shot, and Secretary Seward and his son Frederick have been assassinated. "Where," asked Welles, "was the president shot?" "At Ford's Theater," the messenger replied, adding that the Sewards had been attacked at home. "Damn the rebels," Welles cursed. "This is their work." He walked with the messenger to the Seward's house. Stanton, just behind Welles, charged up the stairs to Seward's bedroom. It was true. A scene of mayhem replaced the calm that Stanton had seen a little more than an hour before. The bed was saturated with blood. Several doctors hovered above the bloody Secretary of State, working to save his life. Fanny Seward was wandering like a pale ghost, her dress dripping with blood. That was not all. Augustus Seward had been stabbed, and his brother Frederick was unconscious from a crushed skull. Brave Sergeant Robinson had endured multiple stab wounds. Recovering from their initial shock, Stanton and Welles realized that there was nothing they could do for the victims. It was in the hands of doctors and God. They turned their thoughts to the president and the rest of the cabinet. Stanton gave orders to rush military guards to the home of every member of the cabinet and to Vice President Johnson's hotel. Without guards or army escort, despite the danger that might still lurk in Washington, Stanton and Welles rode in a carriage to Ford's Theater. As the carriage clipped along, it passed men and women running crazily in all directions. The closer they got to Ford's, the thicker the crowds became. As the carriage turned down F Street, it approached a roaring, angry mob of thousands of people swarming in the street in front of Ford's. On 10th Street, Dr. Leal ordered Lincoln's bearers to head straight for the man with the candle standing at the top of the stairs at the Peterson house. The soldiers carried the president up this curved staircase. In this elevated position, the near lifeless body of Abraham Lincoln became visible to the entire crowd gathered below. In awe, the people watched as their president disappeared into the boarding house. Except for a handful of doctors, government officials, and family friends who would enter the Peterson house, that glimpse of the president ascending the stairs was the last time Americans saw Abraham Lincoln alive. Almost 13 miles out of Washington, Booth and Herold approached their destination, Surrattsville, Maryland. The town was small, little more than a crossroads outpost, named after the family that owned the tavern there. Before they could continue on their escape south, the fugitives had business at the tavern. They would pick up these shooting irons Mary Surratt had ordered Mr. Lloyd to get ready that afternoon. Surratt's place was hard to spot at night. The plain two-story structure was unpainted, and the dull wood boards reflected no moonlight. The tavern would serve three functions: saloon, inn, and post office. In 1864, Mary Surratt, under a cloud of suspicion over her husband's loyalty to the Union, had moved her family to her Washington, D.C. boarding house and rented the tavern to John Lloyd. The tavern operated as a typical 19th century roadside establishment. It was divided into private and public spaces. Paying customers entered, not through the front door, but through a side door that led directly into the bar and post office. The room smelled like wax, candles, oil lamps, tobacco, burned stove wood, whiskey, dirty clothes, and leather boots. Drink and meal prices were posted on a wall or chalked on a board. Nighttime callers were not unusual. Booth and Herold rode their horses to the side entrance. The night was still. Inside, the tavern was quiet and dark. They had to make this quick. Herold dismounted and walked to the door while Booth remained in the saddle. They had no time to waste, and it would hurt Booth too much to dismount and put weight on his foot. Herold's pounding fist finally roused the innkeeper. John Lloyd climbed out of bed, went downstairs, and opened the side door. He recognized David Herold, a friend of John Surratt. Herold, impatient, hissed at him, "Lloyd, for God's sake, make haste and get those things." Herold didn't have to be more specific. Lloyd knew what they wanted. After Mary Surratt's afternoon visit, he took the shooting irons from their hiding place so they would be ready for the callers. Lloyd returned in a moment, bearing a small package wrapped in twine, the binoculars, and a loaded Spencer repeating carbine. Booth would further arm himself when he picked up his pistols at his next stop. As Booth and Herold prepared to ride away, Booth could not resist the temptation to brag. The impulsive actor had to tell someone of his achievement, or he would burst. He told Lloyd, "I'm pretty certain that we have assassinated the President and Secretary Seward." Lloyd watched the pair ride off into the night, not understanding exactly what Booth had meant. He went back to bed. Booth and Herold spent less than 5 minutes in Surrattsville. They continued to the southeast for an unplanned but necessary detour. Booth's leg was throbbing painfully. He needed a doctor, and he knew just where to find one, 4 hours' ride away. At the Peterson house, Abraham Lincoln would soon have more doctors than he could ever want, but little use for any of them. Abraham Lincoln's body was carried into the dim hallway that led to the rear of the boarding house. As the bearers shuffled along through the tight passageway, they passed the parlors and stepped into the back room. The boarder who rented the room was out for the evening, celebrating the end of the war. Leal examined the small room with a bed, its headboard wedged into a corner. He glanced around the room. This place would have to do. Chasing after the president, Mary Todd Lincoln, followed by Clara Harris and Major Rathbone, with Laura Keene trailing close behind, burst into the boarding house. Wringing her hands, Mrs. Lincoln pleaded, "Where is my husband? Where is my husband?" to no one in particular. In the back bedroom, only one person mattered now. Someone tore back the bedding. Someone else turned up the valve of the gas jet coming out of the wall. In an instant, the hissing, burning gas vapor lit the grotesque scene. The others laid the unconscious body across the mattress. Mary Todd Lincoln burst into the room, and the bright gaslight confirmed to her that this was not a nightmare she hoped it was. This was real. The air in the room was warm and moist, with too many people in it competing for the oxygen from the air. Leal ordered the windows opened, and everyone but the doctors to leave the room. Mrs. Lincoln hovered over her husband. Leal gently encouraged her to leave the room and wait in the front parlor. Alone with their patient, the doctors worked quickly, removing the president's clothes. Strangers slipped into the Peterson house before guards could be posted at the door. People invaded the house, inched their way down the hallway, closer to Lincoln. If someone did not take command of the situation soon, the house would be in chaos. Stanton's carriage came to a stop, unable to get through the crowd. If they could not drive through, they would walk. On foot, in the dark, in the midst of thousands of people, anything could happen that night. Indeed, it already had. But now, Stanton and Wells exited the carriage, headed into the mob, and vanished from sight. The doctors examined Lincoln's body for knife or gunshot wounds, but found nothing other than the bullet hole in his head. The president's feet and legs were already getting cold. The eyelids were so filled with blood that they looked bruised, like someone had punched the president in the face. All signs were consistent with a catastrophic injury to the brain. The surgeons covered Lincoln's body with a sheet and blankets. His breathing was regular, but heavy, interrupted with an occasional sigh. They laid a clean white napkin over the bloodstains on the pillow. They placed a small chair at the head of the bed near Lincoln's face. Now, the president was ready for Mary to see him again. Leal sent an officer to fetch her. She rushed into the room and sat beside her husband. "Love, live but for one moment to speak to me once, to speak to our children." Lincoln was deaf to her pleas. With the president's medical condition stable for the moment, Dr. Leal sent messengers to fetch Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's eldest son, Surgeon General Joseph K. Barnes, Lincoln's family physician, another surgeon, and the president's pastor, the Reverend Dr. Phineas T. Gurley. Leal sent a hospital steward in search of a special piece of medical equipment, a Niloton probe. There was work to do inside Lincoln's brain. Ignoring the danger of the surging crowd, Stanton pushed through, up the stairs, and into the back bedroom of the Peterson house. The sight of the president shocked him. He did not need doctors to tell him what would happen. Abraham Lincoln was going to die, and there was nothing the doctors could do about it. But he could do something for the president. He could protect and defend the country. Stanton took charge, making the back parlor of the Peterson house his field office. He would not return to the War Department yet, but would remain here. Stanton believed that the Lincoln and Seward assassinations had exposed a Confederate plot to kill the leaders of the national government in an attempt to reverse the results of the Civil War. Stanton and his lieutenants assumed that all the cabinet heads had been marked for death that night, and the rebel army might be advancing on Washington at that moment. Stanton wanted his commanding general, Ulysses S. Grant, back in Washington. He sent a telegram to order Grant back to Washington at once. It was the first telegram issued from the temporary War Department headquarters at the Peterson house. Stanton ordered troops to turn out into the streets, the guards to be doubled, military forts to be alert, guns manned, and special guards to be posted around the Union Capitol prison. "Clear away the mob from the street in front of the house," Stanton ordered. Soldiers tried to push back the crowd from around the foot of the staircase. The immediate area secured, Stanton turned to a second mission, launching the investigation into the crimes that had occurred at Ford's and at the Seward house. He was determined to catch the criminals. He made it clear he was in charge. Later, when Vice President Johnson arrived at the deathbed, he remained in the background and chose not to take charge. In the days to follow, newly sworn-in President Johnson left it to Stanton to bring Lincoln's killer and his accomplices to justice. Stanton had witnesses from Ford's Theater brought before him. One witness after another swore it was Booth, John Wilkes Booth, who had shot the president. Stanton's operators could wire news and orders all over the country, and soon telegraph lines across the nation were announcing the news. The president had been assassinated and the Secretary of State attacked. Messages were telegraphed to Baltimore, New York, and beyond. Search the trains, guard the bridges. Orders were sent to commanders in the field of Virginia, chasing down leads based on early but false information Stanton received from tipsters. In need of help, at 1:10 a.m. on April 15th, Stanton sent a request to the chief of police in New York City asking him to send his best detectives to assist in the investigation of the assassinations. He continued to expand the search, activating manhunters in Delaware and Pennsylvania. Booth was identified to detectives as the assassin. Orders were sent to cover possible water escape routes. Cavalry rode to the Algonquin River to intercept anyone who attempted to cross. Fishermen along the river were notified to keep watch for Booth. The hunt had begun in earnest. Back in Washington, Army Major General Halleck made plans to imprison the assassins when they were caught. If Booth was captured, the Army would have to protect him from Lincoln's avengers, rampaging mobs of vigilantes who might storm the old Capitol prison if they discovered Booth was jailed there. It was too risky to imprison Booth anywhere on land. Halleck issued an order. If the assassins were caught, put them in double irons and take them to the commander of the Washington Navy Yard, who will confine them to a monitor warship anchored there. The river would protect Booth from the angry citizens of Washington. Now, all they had to do was catch John Wilkes Booth, Lewis Powell, John Surratt, David Herold, and George Atzerodt. The doctors probed Lincoln's bullet wound with their bare, dirty fingers, sticking their pinkies inside Lincoln's brain. They used the Nelaton probe to find the bullet for possible removal, as if that would have helped Lincoln. Eventually, the physicians gave up their tinkering and simply monitored Lincoln's heartbeat, temperature, and breathing. While Lincoln still lived, the manhunt was already underway. At Ford's Theater, the Derringer pistol, the murder weapon, was recovered from the floor of the president's box. Soldiers and detectives rushed to Booth's room at the National Hotel. Of course, Booth was gone, but they searched his trunk and discovered an incredible and mysterious letter to Booth signed only Sam that described a large conspiracy against the Union government. Several blocks from the National Hotel, just a few hours after the assassination, a group of detectives showed up at Mary Surratt's boarding house. In the chaos on the streets outside Ford's Theater, one or more sources reported that John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt were close friends, and that Mrs. Surratt's boarding house was only just a few blocks away. A boarder and school friend of John Surratt, Louis Weichman, was the first to appear at the door to respond to the patrol's arrival. The detectives announced their mission. They were to search the house for John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt. Weichman knocked on Mrs. Surratt's bedroom door, telling her that detectives had come to search the house. She instructed Weichman to let them in. Weichman seemed not to know why the house was being searched. One detective revealed the shocking and half-false information to the occupants of Surratt's boarding house. John Wilkes Booth has shot the president, and John Surratt has assassinated the Secretary of State. Weichman told the detectives John Surratt was not home, but in Canada, and offered to help them with their investigation. Mary Surratt claimed not to know where her son was. The detective searched the house, then left, leaving Weichman, Mary, and her daughter Anna behind. Throughout the night and into the early morning, Mary Todd Lincoln made regular visits to her husband's bedside. At one point she wailed, "Oh, that my little Taddy might see his father before he died," then fainted, falling to the floor. Stanton, startled by her cry and fearing that the president had died, rushed into the room and called out loudly, "Take that woman out and do not let her in again." She did not deserve that cruelty. It did not matter. Stanton was obeyed. After riding half the night on the deserted road south from Surrattsville, Booth and David Herold neared their destination, an isolated farmhouse a few miles north of a village called Bryantown. A city-dwelling night rider, unfamiliar with the remote area, might have missed the turnoff in the dark, but Booth rode confidently ahead. He had been here before. There appeared a handsome, two-story house in the distance. Booth recognized their sanctuary at once. They could rest here. They would not be rushed, as they were at Surratt's Tavern, which was much too close to Washington and possible pursuers. Here, farther south and in the darkness of this remote countryside, they could rest, eat, and sleep. And Booth could get medical care for his injured leg, which he was sure was broken. He needed to renew his strength after being awake for almost 24 hours. He was dog-tired, and his weary body ached from 5 bumpy hours on horseback. The spring night air was still and eerily silent. Booth and Herold approached the farmhouse. No barking dogs warned of their arrival, and the slow pace of their horses' hooves failed to awaken the 6 people sleeping in the house. Herold dismounted and walked to the house while Booth remained in his saddle. The assassin was alert for signs or sounds of danger. No lamplight shone through the window into the front yard. David would have to wake the people inside. He knocked on the door and waited for signs of life within the house. The loud rapping awoke the farmer, who was alarmed at being awakened in the middle of the night. The farmer rose from his bed, walked to the front door, and called, "Who's there?" to the people on the other side. "2 strangers," replied David Herold, "on their way to Washington." One of their horses had fallen, he claimed, throwing the rider and breaking his leg. Hesitating, the farmer peered through a window, then unlocked the door. In his front yard, he saw two men about 20 feet away standing under a cedar tree. He approached them. Booth relaxed at the sight of a familiar face. The farmer helped Booth dismount, offering support when the fugitive's body weight bore down on his injured leg. Booth grimaced in pain when his feet touched the ground. He staggered into the arms of Dr. Samuel A. Mudd. Their faces only inches apart, Mudd helped Booth limp up the steps and into his home. Harold tended to the horses, then followed Booth and Dr. Mudd inside the farmhouse. Harold was a stranger to Mudd. The doctor had never laid eyes on him before, but Booth was not. The chain of events that led John Wilkes Booth to Mudd's farm at the pre-dawn hours of April 15, 1865, began 6 months earlier in Montreal, Canada. By late 1864, Booth had hatched the risky plan to kidnap President Lincoln. He attempted to recruit accomplices in New York City, a place where there were many Lincoln haters and Confederate sympathizers. Booth knew the city well, of course. He had acted there many times. North of New York, Canada was a major base of operations for the Confederate Secret Service. In Montreal, nests of rebel agents with plans and money were busy hatching anti-Union conspiracies. Booth sought contacts there. He and his little band of conspirators would snatch Lincoln and transport him out of Washington south to Richmond. He needed no less than a rebel version of the Underground Railroad that transported runaway slaves north to freedom. Booth's railroad, however, would run in reverse. He would take the tyrant Lincoln, who had freed the slaves, south to the Confederate capital of Richmond. He would trade Lincoln for Confederate prisoners of war, or attempt to use his captive as leverage to give the South an advantage in peace negotiations. To pull off this plan, he needed loyal Confederate agents and safe houses located at points along the route. One operative he met in Canada gave Booth letters of introduction vouching for the actor's devotion to the Confederacy and requesting aid for him. One of the letters was addressed to Dr. Samuel A. Mudd. Mudd, 32 years old, was a doctor living on a farm with his wife and family. He was anti-Union, anti-black, and the owner of up to 11 slaves before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had freed them. By November 9, 1864, Booth had visited the Bryantown Tavern in southern Maryland. A combination saloon, inn, and post office, not unlike Surratt's Tavern, was known amongst Confederate sympathizers as a reliable safe house and place to exchange information. A few days later, at church, Booth was introduced to Dr. Mudd. In Maryland, a month later, Booth again encountered Mudd at church. Booth invented a cover story. He claimed to be looking for real estate and a horse to buy. Booth needed horses for the kidnapping gang he hoped to put together. Samuel Mudd was happy to help. After church, Booth rode home with the doctor and spent the night at his farm. Mudd introduced Booth to a neighbor who sold Booth a peculiar one-eyed horse. Dr. Mudd had been helpful to Booth in Maryland, but the actor also needed the doctor's help and introduction in Washington. Mudd went to Washington to introduce Booth to a Confederate courier named John Harrison Surratt. Surratt operated out of his mother's boarding house on H Street and from her country tavern at Surrattsville. Booth would require the type of help Surratt could provide along his escape route. On the way to the H Street boarding house, Booth and Mudd encountered John Surratt on the street, and the introduction took place. Booth invited everyone, Mudd, Surratt, and Louis Weichman, a friend of Surratt's and a boarder at the H Street house, back to his room at the National Hotel for drinks and private conversation. Booth recruited Surratt into the conspiracy to kidnap the president and soon became a frequent visitor to the boarding house, where he befriended Surratt's widowed mother and his young sister Anna. His work done, Mudd returned, just before Christmas 1864, to his farm and waited for further word from Booth about the kidnapping. No word ever came. Lincoln's second inauguration came and went in March. Richmond fell on April 3rd. Lee surrendered on April 9th. But Dr. Mudd saw no more of Booth. Booth had sent liquor and supplies to Mudd's farm for hiding until the day came for Booth and his kidnap victim to flee the city, but it never did. Given the disastrous events of April 1865, Mudd assumed that the Union victory had changed the actor's plans and the scheme to kidnap the president had been abandoned. Now, 4 months later, Booth was here at his farm again, though the doctor, standing in the darkness of his front yard, did not know it yet. Once inside, Booth sat on a sofa in the front parlor, then reclined. Mudd lit an oil lamp and dialed up the frame to permit a proper examination of his new patient. Their eyes locked in recognition. In an instant, the doctor knew the identity of the man who was lying in front of him. How could he fail to recognize the actor's familiar thick black hair, pale complexion, trademark mustache, and striking good looks? The first step in the examination process would be to pry the thigh-high cavalry boot off Booth's left leg. Mudd stood at one end of the sofa, took a firm grip of the heel and sole, and tugged. Booth's jaw clamped tight in pain. The boot would not budge. The injury to Booth's leg had caused the tissue to swell up and create a seal that could not be broken, without inflicting injury upon the patient and possibly worsening the injury. Mudd made a cut on the boot near the ankle, careful not to cut too deeply and open Booth's soft flesh. Mudd seized the boot firmly and pulled slowly. This time it slipped off. He dropped the boot to the floor, removed Booth's sock, pushed his pant leg up his calf, and began the examination. The diagnosis was simple: a broken fibula. Mudd informed Booth that he had a broken bone about 2 inches above the ankle joint. The doctor did not regard it as particularly dangerous or painful, reassuring Booth that he could treat the injury. He improvised a splint for Booth. It was now about 5:00 a.m. Booth knew he should press on south. He knew he was still traveling ahead of the news of the assassination, which Mudd was not yet aware of. He knew that news would spread and overtake him, making the daylight hours unsafe for traveling. Booth weighed the risk of capture against his desire for food and rest. No one in the world knew he had gone to Mudd's tonight. He had not known he would go there himself until after he shot Lincoln and injured his leg. Better to hide out and chance discovery than be caught in open country at sunrise. He and Harold would spend what few hours remained of this night at the farm, rest there all day, and then ride south at nightfall. Mudd invited the pair to rest in his house for the night. He offered them a room upstairs and bade them good night. Unknown to Mudd, he had just extended his hospitality to Lincoln's assassin and his accomplice. Their secret still safe from Mudd and his family, and their location a mystery to the manhunters, Harold and Booth collapsed into their beds. As Booth drifted off to sleep, he did not know whether his master plan had succeeded or failed. Had George Atzerodt and Lewis Powell carried out their missions and murdered Vice President Johnson and Secretary Seward? And what of the president? Had Booth killed Abraham Lincoln? Or did the tyrant still live? Booth did not know he would be damned in the morning newspapers as the most wanted man in America. While Booth and Harold slept at the Mudd farmhouse, the 1st Cavalry Patrol rode south from Washington, headed for Maryland. Soon, this group from the 13th New York Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant David Dana, would ride close to Mudd's farm. Booth had about 7 hours.